Welcome back. Today we're talking about Alexander the Great. This is the last video for the ancient Greeks. So if you want to follow along, it's Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic World PDF file. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far has been during the Hellenic period of Greek history. Now we're talking about the Hellenistic period, the time after Alexander the Great. We don't know much about Alexander. There's four ancient historians, Arrian, Diodorus, Curtius, and Plutarch. They lived a long time out after Alexander, sometimes hundreds of years, but that's kind of where we get our information from. Macedonia, Macedon, is the new country to the north of the Greeks that's kind of a threat to the Greeks. Philip of Macedonia, he's Alexander's father. He comes to power in 360 BC. He had spent some time in the Greek city-state of Thebes, so he's familiar with Greek culture and politics. Basically, Philip of Macedonia will conquer the Greeks, and then he'll die, and his son will kind of take over for him. Alexander the Great, like I said, his father is Philip. His mother is Olympias. There's kind of some stories from Plutarch about how Zeus may be the father of Alexander the Great. If you look at slide 8, that's a painting of this legend that Philip was looking in on his wife, peeking in on her because she's unfaithful, and Zeus is sometimes portrayed as a snake. So basically, Zeus and Olympia slept together, and Philip's not really the father of Alexander. Zeus is the father. And there's also this legend that because Philip peeked in on his wife, sleeping with Zeus, he's going to lose an eye for that. And Philip does lose an eye in battle, in warfare later on. But Philip has very good military strategies for his Macedonian armies. He gets kind of a phalanx on steroids. He takes the Greek phalanx and makes it stronger. He intervenes in a lot of these Greek squabbles. The Greeks still fight amongst each other after the Peloponnesian War. Like, that never seems to go away. Philip ends up defeating the Greeks. I'm on slide 15, the Battle of Chaeronea. Alexander and Philip fight at this battle, and this is kind of when they conquer the Greeks. So Philip II has conquered the Greeks. Something called the Corinthian League is formed, just kind of this Greek alliance. They named Philip as their leader. So you kind of get, the Greeks are now ruled basically by Macedonia. Philip and Greece decide to go to war against Persia. So after he conquered the Greeks, Philip had his eye on the Persian Empire. But something stops him. He gets assassinated. He took another bride. A lot of times what Philip would do is when he conquered an area, he would marry someone from there to kind of cement his alliances with that new place he conquered. Philip and Cleopatra, whatever child they have will actually be the next king, not Alexander. Olympias, Alexander's mother, is from Epirus. It's not considered Greek. So basically, Alexander's not going to be the future king. At the wedding party, Attalus, which I believe was it was Cleopatra's brother, I think. So they're at this wedding party for Philip and Cleopatra. Somebody gives a toast to Philip and Cleopatra and Attalus says, I hope that Philip and Cleopatra will produce an heir to the throne. And Alexander's sitting over here thinking like, hey, I'm supposed to be the heir. I'm already my father's right-hand man. I've helped him win military battles. So Alexander yells some profanity at Attalus. Philip gets up and is going to go kill Alexander with his sword. And Philip trips as he's walking to Alexander because he's drunk. And Alexander says something smart-alecky like, the man who would conquer the world can't even walk across the room, kind of mocking his father. Alexander and his mother Olympia get sent into exile. But like I said, Philip gets assassinated in 336 BC. He gets replaced by his son Alexander. Alexander and his mother Olympia. Olympia is put to death. Cleopatra's son, she ends up committing suicide, I believe. So basically, they consolidate their rule. They did find the tomb of Philip II. I've got some pictures up here. Alexander the Great does some mopping up on the Greece mainland, but then he ends up going into Persia. Before he goes to Persia, Alexander personally goes to the oracle at Delphi and asks, "Am I the son of a god?" Basically, is Zeus my father? Okay, look at slide 32. That's basically Alexander's empire when he's done with his conquest. So he dies in 323 BC. So about a decade of conquering the Persian Empire, which includes Egypt, Syria, kind of the Near East, goes all the way to India. So how does he do that? He invades in 334 BC. The Persian Empire is so huge, it takes a while to gather troops into battle and then go fight Alexander. So basically the satraps, these are the Persian governors, the satraps of Anatolia decide, let's just fight Alexander right away. Let's not wait for the whole Persian Empire to get here. That would just take too long. At the Battle of Granicus River, this is kind of the first big battle. Alexander is victorious. He defeats the Persians. He is victorious. He starts marching farther and farther into the Persian Empire. He reaches this town called Gordium. There's this legend that whoever can untie the Gordian knot will be king. If you look at slide 39, there's kind of a picture of the Gordian knot. Basically, what ends up happening is it's this chariot that's just tied together. And what he does is he just cuts the rope. You're supposed to find the ends and untie it, but it's this big ball of rope that's just tangled up. He just cuts it. He doesn't look for the ends to untie it. He cuts it with a sword. Some people say it's cheating, but he says it doesn't matter how you do it as long as you get the job done. Alexander marches farther and farther into the Persian Empire. He's battling Darius III. Darius III is the ruler of the Persians. They meet at this place called Issus. Alexander defeats Darius there. Darius actually sends Alexander a letter and says, "I'll give you all of my kingdom west of the Euphrates. I'll give you the hand of one of my daughters in marriage. Let's form an alliance." So Darius knows that he's going to get defeated by Alexander. Alexander replies that he is the king of Asia, and he invites Darius to fight for his throne, not the other way around. Alexander goes south to conquer Tyre. Then he eventually goes to Egypt. Tyre is kind of on the coast of the Near East, so kind of Lebanon. He builds these huge causeways out to defeat the soldiers at Tyre. Eventually he goes to Egypt. He spends some time there. He founds Alexandria, which is a really famous city in the ancient world. He goes and visits an oracle in Egypt, and he asks the priest, "Am I a god?" And the priest supposedly said yes, although there's some debate if the priest mixed up his words. I think the priest talked to him in Greek, but didn't know his Greek very well, so he may have accidentally told him he's a god. Alexander knows that he has to totally defeat Darius, otherwise he can't really be king of Persia. So he keeps fighting Darius. The two armies meet at Gaugamela in 331 BC. There's a story about how Alexander's generals go out and they see all the fires of the Persians, and they're like, "There's too many Persians for us to fight. During the day, you need to go attack them at night and surprise them." And Alexander says, "I won't steal my victory. If I'm going to be victorious, it's going to be in the daylight." The Persians had these scythes or sickles on their chariots, which, would be pretty devastating. Alexander wins another victory. He eventually gets control of the heartland of Persia. These big cities, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. Persepolis is the capital of the Persian Empire. It falls to Alexander. Alexander burns Persepolis as revenge for Xerxes burning Athens during the Persian Wars. You can see some pictures of what remains on slide 59, 60. So Darius is still fleeing Alexander's armies. Eventually, Darius is assassinated by one of his own. Alexander doesn't think that he should have died this way. He's mad. So Alexander ends up handing over Darius's assassins so that he can be executed. But Alexander does control the whole Persian Empire now. And this is where Alexander starts to make some mistakes. He starts to act like a Persian. Remember, his men are Greeks and Macedonians. And, you know, if you're a Greek, the Persians are kind of the cultural enemy of the Greeks. You know, the Greeks believe in democracy, philosophy, you know, progress. The Persians are autocratic. You know, they're ruled by a dictator, you know, an absolutist king who can do whatever he wants. Alexander kind of forgets his Greekness and starts to behave more like the Persians. He engages in something called proskynesis. Basically, if you look at slide 66, when you come to the Persian king, you're supposed to bow down to him, to kiss his hand, to kiss your hand to the king, basically to show your submission. There's even some talk about how if you're in the presence of the king, you're not even supposed to talk unless you're given permission, because your voice would pollute the air that the king breathes. If you look at slide 68, there's a clip from the movie Alexander, which kind of shows how Alexander starts acting more like a Persian, and this makes his soldiers angry. Eventually, Alexander marches on, goes towards India. He marries people. He marries women in the lands he conquers to cement alliances with him. So basically, like proskynesis, Alexander dresses in Persian clothing. He marries Persian women. This upsets his Greek and Macedonian soldiers because they're like, hey man, you're forgetting who you are. Alexander kills people around him that have helped him so far. So Alexander kind of starts to lose it. Eventually, his men say, we're not marching any further east. We want to go home. So Alexander is forced to turn around. You know, who knows how far he would have gone if his men would have stuck with him. But he ends up going home. And on his way home in Babylon, he catches some type of fever and he dies. So he never makes it back home to Macedonia. But he does conquer the huge Persian Empire. If you look at slide 77, that's kind of a map that shows you the extent of his conquest. So pretty impressive. On his deathbed, his generals want to know who's supposed to rule after him. And supposedly, when they say who's supposed to rule, Alexander said, you know, my empire should go to the best man. Whoever can seize power, it's yours. So basically, after Alexander dies, his generals are fighting for his empire. If you look at slide 80, that kind of shows you how his huge empire is divided up. You have something called the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia and the Balkans. You got the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. You got the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia. But basically, these empires fight with each other forever just because they're rivals. Alexander's conquest ushered in the Hellenistic period. This is kind of a new culture that arises. Basically, you have a mixing of Hellenistic or of Greek and Oriental kind of Eastern cultures. They go back and forth. So this Hellenistic period lasts from 323 to about 31 BC. 31 BC is when the Romans win victory and they kind of control everything in the area. So because of Alexander, Greek culture spreads east. Plutarch talks about how Alexander founded over 70 cities and spreads the Greek way of life. The Hellenistic world is one of wealth, ease of travel, movement, cultural dissemination, cosmopolitanism. So basically, like I've said over and over, Greek culture spreads east. Now they don't totally get rid of the Eastern culture, but there is some back and forth. Greek democracy is gone. You basically start to have empires and kingdoms. Trade expands and opens up. Alexandria is probably one of the most famous cities, maybe 1 million people in the ancient world. You get kind of a lot more science during the Hellenistic era. Euclid formulated rules of geometry. Archimedes created all sorts of gadgets and advanced experimental science. Um, Aristarchus formulated the heliocentric theory. You know, the sun is at the center of the universe, not the earth. Um, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. Ptolemy created a theory of motion of the planets and the moon. He kind of added an added mathematical element to astronomy. You got Hellenistic literature that kind of surfaces during this time. So writing kind of changes as well. You get new types of philosophy. The two new philosophies are Epicureanism and Stoicism. I'll let you kind of read about those, but these are just kind of new philosophies. There's also the philosophy of Stoicism, or sorry, that's what I said. Epicureanism and Stoicism are these two new philosophies. There's also skepticism. That's what I meant to say. Um, the idea that nothing can be proven. Since all your knowledge is derived from your sense perception, and since your sense perception can't be always accurate, how do we know what we know? So during the Hellenistic era, there's new types of science or advances in science. There's new types of literature. There's new types of philosophy. Basically, a lot of cultural changes. So we've kind of wrapped up the Greeks. Now we're going to focus on the Romans. Now, this is kind of this is what happens with history. We're going to focus on the Romans. The Greeks are still there. Their history is still progressing. They still have stuff going on, but we just don't talk about them really anymore because we're focused on the Romans. So don't forget that the Greeks still live there. They still exist, but basically they don't do anything of significance compared to the Romans. So the Romans are where we're headed next.